We heartily welcome our next speaker, Professor Dr. Guido Palazzo, who is currently a professor of business ethics at ECEC University of Lausanne. More than 40,000 people have already attended his online course on unethical decision-making in organizations on Coursera.org. Furthermore, he has worked with numerous companies in Europe, Asia and the USA on ethics and compliance. Dr. Palazzo studied business administration and philosophy at the University of Bamberg and wrote his PhD in political philosophy at the University of Marburg. He strongly believes that guaranteeing human dignity in supply chain is no longer optional.
I guess the fact that I see me means I can start. So good morning, everybody. Maybe I start with a disclaimer. The reason why you see me not in this fancy studio in Munich, but you see me at home, is due to the fact that I'm just coming out of a COVID infection and my voice might sometimes crack and I might cough a little bit, so be patient with me. You have heard that I'm going to talk about failure. I'm going to talk about history. I'm working on business and human rights since 1996, when I started to write my PhD that targeted exactly that topic. And I'm often referring, when we talk about looking back in history, to the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who once said that history is a great teacher, but it has no students. So there's a lot we can learn by looking back. There's a lot we can do differently today when we more or less all now face, being legally obliged, the duty to manage human rights in supply chains. Because this is a topic that exists. Sorry? Sorry, I heard a voice, but I'm told I can just continue. This debate is not new. The legal dimension might be new, and we will discuss about this in the podium afterwards. But the fact that companies are confronted with human rights violations in their supply chain started in the 1990s. And it is the result of the globalization of corporate supply chains. You must imagine this as one of the major results of the fall of the Berlin Wall, of the collapse of the communist system, when from that point on, corporations started to globally stretch the operations and somehow transformed into multinational supply chains, shifting production in other parts of the world. So this is something that is rather new in the history of capitalism, and it came with some problems. These problems basically consisted in the fact that until then, companies were producing Western companies were producing in more or less well-regulated contexts, and they were embedded in nation states, while suddenly they could shift into places where there was no regulation, there was corrupt regulation, there was weak regulation. So suddenly this traditional division of labor, companies focus on business and governments regulate, was disrupted. The first companies going global were Levi's and Nike. And they were also the first to be confronted with accusations that in their suppliers, human rights were violated. The first reaction of these companies, well, that might be the case, but that's not us. We are a different company. We are in the US or in some other countries, but these are legally independent suppliers. We are not responsible for them. Since then, the pressure of NGOs has led to the more or less taken for granted rule that companies can be held and are held responsible for the human rights violations to which they are connected in their supply chains. And the new laws that are emerging now everywhere in the world are a kind of preliminary endpoint of that change. We take it for granted now that companies do not just have to manage human rights in their direct supply chain with their direct suppliers, but potentially across the whole chain. We can discuss whether this is justified or not. That's the expectation. Now, how did companies react to this pressure in the 90s, in the early 2000s? Three things. First of all, they drafted codes of conduct, and they sent those code of conducts to their suppliers. And they installed departments, CSR departments, where they normally called, to manage this challenge in their supply chain. They managed this by giving the code and controlling the auditor via audits. In the first step, these companies like Levi's and Nike did their own audits until they were attacked for lack of credibility. I mean, if you control your own suppliers and you come back with a report saying everything is fine, there's a conflict of interest. So they switched to audits coming from independent actors like the Fair Labor Association, one of the big providers of these audits and standards. That's where we are in the moment where these laws now come. Now, if you are now in a company responsible for maybe setting up a system to manage human rights violations and challenge the risks in your supply chain, there are three things you can learn from what the companies in the last 30 years did wrong. And I would like to highlight the first and probably most important one. Over these years of supply chain management with regards to human rights, companies had two kind of people who went to suppliers: procurement people and CSR people, sustainability people. The procurement people were telling the supplier, you produce this t-shirt for $1.50 and not more. The CSR person was coming and telling the supplier, here's our code of conduct, please respect human rights and implement that code. Now, what this created for suppliers was what the psychologist Gregory Bateson called a double bind. A double bind means you get two orders, and both are contradictory. Someone tells you, do X, and then they tell the same person tells you, don't do X. What does that mean in this context? Well, the supplier understood very clearly that if they would want to compete with the prices in their market, if they wanted to comply with the cost pressure that came with the prices the customer was willing to pay, they were not able to implement sophisticated CSR programs because they didn't have the money. They wouldn't make any profit anymore. If they would implement what the CSR manager was expecting them to do, they wouldn't be able to produce for these prices. So that's a double bind. Whatever you choose, you are wrong. You will not be able to satisfy both. So what did they do? Well, as we found out over the years is that in some studies, 80 to 90% of the audits that companies do with their suppliers are confronted with fraud. Suppliers cheat. They cheat, they create a kind of fake environment in where rules are implemented, while in reality, when the auditor goes away, human rights violations come back, or they take place in most parts of the factory that the auditor will never see. So all kinds of tricks were used simply to survive. So this is not because they are bad people. It's because they had to manage, on the one hand, the procurement people squeezing them for every penny, and on the other side, growing expectations about human rights, and then over time also environmental issues. This is a dilemma not just for those who cheat. It creates also a dilemma for those who are honest suppliers. Because imagine you are a supplier and you do what you're told. You engage in sustainability and CSR, you treat your workers well, you have higher costs, you somehow deal with that, you manage that. But your customer is not able to see the difference between what you do and your competitor who is committing fraud. Because both of you succeed in the audit. So what would you do? You probably also at one point start to think about committing fraud, because if what you do is not even visible compared to the fraud, why would you continue doing that? So the first point that I would want to make here is you cannot manage human rights well if at the same time you push your supplier to the wall with your procurement strategy. You cannot squeeze the latest penny out of them and expect them to manage human rights well. So in a way, what we can see is that to a certain degree, human rights violations were even provoked by the multinational companies by this incompatibility of expectations. That's mistake number one. Mistake number two, and this is something we probably don't see that often right now in companies who are now engaging in these topics for a while already. It's a topic that I would call neo-colonial approach. What's that? It's the assumption that we as Western companies, we go to some suppliers in third world countries and tell them, we explain to you now what human rights are and how you have to manage that. And these countries are very often countries in which we had been already as colonialists before. That's why it is called neo-colonial approach. It is done without any sensitivity for local values, cultural differences. It's a one-size-fits-all approach that is applied around the world. That leads to two things. It leads to a disregard for the dignity of those people, which creates resistance, and which might also provoke some of the cheating. And it also leads to highly ineffective CSR measures. In some parts of Africa, people have an expression for CSR projects of Western companies. They call them white elephants. What is a white elephant? A white elephant is, for instance, a hospital that a Western company might build somewhere around a place where they produce. Then they hand this over to someone without even understanding that there's no one who is able to manage that. What will happen next? Well, people will go and steal everything. What remains is this white, empty building. A lot of what has been done over the last 30 years has been dysfunctional in that sense. So that's the second mistake, neo-colonial attitude. The third mistake is that there has never been, no, that's wrong. In some industries that were very early, export goods industry, for instance, clothing, something like this has started. What in most industries is missing is coordination. Imagine you have a supplier somewhere in Bangladesh and you go there with your code of conduct. You are not the only one. There might be 20, 30, 40 other suppliers who also go there with their code of conduct, who also want to do an audit, and who also have a slightly different questionnaire. What it does is it drives suppliers crazy. They have to manage so many different customers with so many slight variations of expectations that they can never use what they do for one for the next one. This is highly ineffective, and again, it increases the risk of fraud. So these are my three challenges that I would invite you to consider when you manage your own program today. Procurement and CSR people divided, neo-colonial attitude, no coordination. Before I go to 3 recommendations where I think you can do better if you would want to learn from these mistakes of the past, I would like to add one thing that complicates the debate right now. It's something that's not totally new. It has been there for a while already. And it became visible the first time in South Africa during the apartheid regime. It's the discussion on not so much human rights violations in your immediate supply chain. It's about the repressive regime that is governing the context in which you have your operations. So it's, in a way, an additional topic to consider when you talk about human rights today. Now, the first company after South Africa and apartheid, the first company making a really painful experience with that was Shell, the oil company, in 1995 in Nigeria, when they were confronted with the protest movement of some Nigerian local people in the region where they were operating, guided by a poet, Ken Saro-Wiwa was his name. And they protested against the fact that all the money that was made in this region by the oil was going into the pockets of the central government, which at that time was a dictator, General Abacha. Now, Ken Saro-Wiwa and his compatriots were arrested, sentenced to death, and killed. When Amnesty International invited Shell to interfere, to help these people, because Shell was the biggest financial source for the dictator, Shell said, we are politically neutral. We don't interfere in politics. This is the idea that has guided the activities of Western companies in repressive regimes for the last 30 years, since globalization kicked off. You are not connected to this repressive regime, you are neutral, you're just operating, you're doing business. This has so far not been a big discussion. Why? Well, because when the wall of Berlin came down, we all naively believed that slowly over time, economic freedom would lead to political freedom. Free markets promote free societies. So these dictatorships, if they also become capitalist, will also become democratic. Francis Fukuyama was speaking about the end of history. Now, this year, with the Ukraine war, with the attack of Putin, this belief system has collapsed. And even the Wall Street Journal is now inviting Western companies to leave Russia. Why? Well, it's very simple. If you stay, you collude. You either are against or supporting such a regime. You cannot be neutral. And we can see this from the shitstorm that Nestle was facing when they hesitated too long. And we can see the first cases of collusion as they are now discussed in the German news. Der Spiegel published an article about one of those companies that stayed in Russia, the German company Knauf, who seems to be involved in actively helping the Kremlin to mobilize their own workers to be sent to war. This is a new dimension. It's the dimension of what can I do if I have activities in a repressive regime, and what are the conditions under which I might need to leave a country. As you also might have read, a lot of companies now discuss what they can learn from the situation in Ukraine for their activities in China, which might be next. So this naive belief that I can go somewhere and just do business is right now collapsing. And that adds a new dimension of human rights violations that you potentially might be connected to, and you might have to manage this when you start managing human rights. Now, my recommendations, very quickly, 3 recommendations, and they all have one headline: collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. The first collaboration. You must collaborate with your suppliers. You cannot, as I said already, you cannot manage human rights while squeezing them to the wall. You cannot focus on cost reduction all the time and hope that they somehow will, on the top, also manage human rights. You must empower them. You must work with them. You must probably set incentives for them to really invest in human rights. For instance, by giving them preferred strategic partnerships instead of switching them all the time. That's my first point. Collaborate with suppliers. My second point, collaborate with local stakeholders. It is probably seemingly much easier to say we have this one approach and we apply this everywhere in the world. But there will be local differences. There will be different resistances, different opportunities. And you can only understand how you manage well the human rights in your supply chain if you listen to people on the ground. And that, in my view, includes, in particular, one big stakeholder that over these 3 decades has been totally neglected, and that is unions and worker councils. Think back at the time before globalization, the second half of the 20th century. Industrial relations were managed by 3 partners: companies who were trying to produce something, governments who were setting the rules, and unions and worker councils paying attention that workers would get a fair share of this production of the company. So there was a kind of triangle of power. Globalization has destroyed this. So we have to renew that, and we have to go back and figure out how to work with the representatives of workers, how to promote even the creation of this self-representation among the workers. So collaboration with stakeholders is my second point. And my third point, you must collaborate with your competitors. And I know that this is legally delicate, to sit in the same room and to discuss how to manage human rights. But you have to find a way. maybe by a transparent and moderated process, but and your legal people will find a way. But it makes no sense that everybody is developing their own approach with their own standard, their own certification, their own code, and their own audits. This will overwhelm the suppliers as it did in the last 30 years, and it will not lead to good results. Because there's one thing, and then I'm done. There's one thing you should keep in mind. Human rights are not a topic in which you should find a kind of leverage for your competitive advantage. It doesn't make sense from a moral perspective to wish that my company has no slaves in their supply chain, but the competitors do, and I'm not telling them how I solved my problem. We need to share. We need to exchange best practices so that everyone can manage human rights and that everywhere human dignity is protected. Thank you.